Hi there, I'm Nic Watt. I'm a user interface designer and user experience designer. And this is part two of my series where I'm kind of investigating and working with the RetroArch team to try and facilitate them improving some aspects of the user interface. So I built a slide deck, which is shared in the links of the video. So feel free to have a look and comment on it. Last time we went through personas in the previous video, and today we're going to be going through metaphors. So the goal, as I said, of this whole slide deck and video series is to help me and also the RetroArch team kind of get a better, more holistic understanding of the ins and outs of the user interface, both positive and negative, and so that we can take a view on ways that we might be able to improve it, particularly for novice users. Now, last time in the previous video, which I'm not really going to deep dive too much into today, we obviously went over personas, and we came up with four main personas, the first one being the games player, the second one being the novice, then the expert, and the developer. And it's worth bearing them in mind because while usually you'll find experts and developers can get a handle on software fairly easily, the user interface becomes much more important as you start to cater for less and less expert-like users, which is obviously something that these metaphors become particularly important for. So what is a metaphor? So from the way I like to think of them is they're like a box or a bucket that contain a bunch of features or functions or concepts that are important to be grouped together. And you may, usually with software, you might have multiple metaphors, right? And the important thing is that one metaphor should be quite substantially different to another metaphor so that the user doesn't become confused as to which one does what, and also that the software developers and user interface designers don't start mixing the metaphors, because as it becomes more vague, the user starts asking the wrong questions about how to use the software and potentially gets frustrated or finds a competing product, right, or a competitor's product to start using, right? And it's worth bearing in mind that we are all, animals, right? And so a lot of our memory and a lot of the ways that humans go about remembering and conceptualizing things is kind of sort of metaphoric. So what I mean by that is in your kitchen, you have a refrigerator which has food in it, right? And then you have a bathroom with your bathroom stuff in it, right? They're containers for your memory shortcutting to, all right, when I want to, have a drink, I'll open the fridge and get juice out, right? It sounds fairly basic, but it's all based on our animal, like physical-based memory. So a good example of this is the retro consoles. Now, retro consoles were very physical devices. Obviously, they output onto television screens or monitors, but they broke down into three main metaphors. So you had the games console itself, which you would turn on or off, obviously plugs into the TV, etc. And it's the thing that ran the game, right? Then you actually had the games themselves. Now, way back in the day, they were obviously all on cartridges, and then CDs and DVDs and so on and so forth. And the game was the thing that contained the data that you would play. And obviously this is all like, we know this, right? But I'm using it as an example to show how the user, and that could have been a 5-year-old child all the way up to 50, 60, 70-year-old adults, right? The user had to be able to easily plug the games console in, easily get what a game was and plug it into the cartridge, plug the cartridge into the console, and then also get what a controller was and the different buttons and be able to plug that in and then use that to control the game, right? So the console manufacturers spent a lot of time, which maybe seems obvious today, educating everyone on these three main metaphors, right? And very, very clear. Now, they got a bit of an advantage because a games console was one physical thing, a game was a different physical thing, and a controller was a third physical thing. And so that latches on very well to human memory, right? As we move forward and we start discussing about RetroArch in particular, that most software is an abstract concept, right? There is very little other than the fact you're maybe using a mouse or a keyboard or whatever to interface with it. It's a very abstract concept. And we've had to, as humans, layer on physical-based concepts so that our animal brains can start figuring out how to use them or remember what to do with X, Y, and Z. As we move it into more modern consoles, so the ones that are maybe potentially on sale at the moment, you still have those original concepts, so the game, the console, the controller. Potentially the game now is digital, but it could also be physical. But now you have additional things, and I'm sure there's more metaphors than I've listed, but some examples are you and I have user accounts, right? I log in as me, you log in as you, your partner or your children or whatever each have their own accounts. And that buckets a whole bunch of stuff, right? You get that. Maybe your save data is contained on your account on some consoles, right? You also have a store where you can go and buy new games, and so on and so forth. And again, it sounds obvious, but these metaphors are robustly supported through the front ends of these consoles so that you don't become confused and go, oh, why am I'm actually playing my son or daughter's account right now, right? We don't want that. We want you to know very quickly that you're logged in as you, or you're logged in as someone else, or that you're in the store versus your games library, right? Very important that there's no confusion about that, particularly if you put down $100 on a game when actually you meant to play something, okay? So RetroArch metaphors are not dissimilar, but there's additional ones because it's not one games console, right, or one machine. It's doing a very ambitious and great thing in it's trying to accommodate or emulate or facilitate the games playing or software use through a bunch of old retro games consoles machines. So you have RetroArch itself, and it has a bunch of settings and features and functions that the user potentially needs to become aware of, particularly in setup, right? Which monitor is it outputting to, or what's the refresh rate, or things like that, right? They're the core settings, maybe what video driver you're using. Then there's cores, and cores are kind of equivalent to the games consoles in the previous example, but obviously RetroArch supports multiple cores, many cores. Some of them are games consoles, some of them are DOS boxes, for example, and they're all bracketed on the games console just for ease of understanding for everyone. Then you have playlists, and playlists are obviously a collection of games, which brings us on to games as a concept, and then also controllers. I'm sure there's a bunch of other metaphors that I've not listed, but the prime ones that most users need to be super familiar with are these. And you can see there that some of this is very similar to the consoles of old, and some of these are new things, particularly obviously the RetroArch, because it's running everything, and the playlist. So before we get on to analysis of maybe improvement stuff, I thought it would be sensible to take a look at some of the user interface from RetroArch. Now, I'm only focusing my commentary on Ozone. There's several different user interfaces for RetroArch. As far as I'm aware, Ozone is the default for the majority, if not all of the default installs now, particularly iOS and Windows, Android, and so on and so forth. I'm led to believe that it's the central one, so that's kind of where I'm starting, where I'm focused. So we can see here, this is all these screenshots actually are from my installation on Windows. This is RetroArch's main menu. Now you can customize it, I think, to start up and land in different places and potentially, look slightly different than this. I've not done that. This is just how it's booted up, and it's, this is what it looks like. So from the user's perspective, particularly novice users, right, they land here, and it's not really telling us very much, and it's certainly not, and I don't mean this as an insult, it probably will sound like one though, it's not really making us celebrate or feel like it's celebrating the work that's gone into all of the games or apps or whatever that are listed in all the playlists, right? It's also not really, and particularly as something that's the main launch screen or home screen, it's not really helping the user start to understand that there's multiple metaphors, right? So the only evidence really of that, and this is largely because I, as a user, kind of know this rather than it telling me, is that this gray area is the RetroArch kind of area where all the RetroArch metaphoric stuff is contained. And the red area is where all our playlists are, right? So at this point, that's not really introducing us to the concept of games nor cores. Now, that might not be important, and that's fine, but from a new user perspective, what we have to start to acknowledge is that it's not helping introduce how these different things fit together, nor helping necessarily build up a good mental image of this, the simple thing like the console does this, the game does that, and the controller does the next thing, okay? Then if we go into a playlist, you can see here this is kind of the first evidence of games. Now there's probably other ways that you could start to see evidence if you maybe deep dived into some of the RetroArch specific settings, but the main one that most users, once they've set it up, will do is come into a playlist. And so you can see the big green box, this box here, is showing the user the games that they've got in that particular playlist, right? Now, there's obviously a bunch of stuff that you can do here. You can name the playlist however you want. Usually by default, it's named after the folder that it's got the games from, and probably more often than not, named after the core or the platform that it's using. And you'll see that's why some of them got images down the side. So from a user's perspective, there's a relative amount of familiarity on the fact that, I've chosen arcade in this example, and this is a bunch of arcade games, right? So, it's not too bad. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most exciting looking user interface from getting you excited about playing games, but it certainly does the job. Now, things that will start to affect the user's ability to conceptually understand the different metaphors that we have is that if everywhere looks the same, then they're not really going to help be able to kind of memorize or hold on to that this metaphor is this and that metaphor is that, right? And so a good example of this is your iPhone, I think. An iPhone has volume buttons on the side, has a power button, and is very clear to the user quite quickly what they do. And then an app is a very individual thing that's listed on the home screen, right? And so the core uses that Apple is concerned about getting you to do are very obvious from the get-go, right? You unlock or open an iPhone, and it's like, oh, there's a bunch of apps. One looks like a phone, one looks like a calculator, and so on and so forth. And so potentially some of the friction that RetroArch faces is that it's not really doing that. And so there's an awful lot of leaps that the user has to take to start to understand where things are, right? And this will become more apparent. So as we, like this screen and this screen don't look that different, right? And then the following screen, so this is when you actually choose a game. This is where we start to find some interesting mixture of the metaphors. Now, many of these features are necessary, so I'm not suggesting that they should be removed or necessarily changed. But for a new user, right, you've got at the top run and rename, which are related to games. Run is likely the thing that they're most excited about, and the other ones are more functional. And potentially, in an ideal world, something that they shouldn't really have to mess around with very often, right? So for the most part, they just want to play the game or run the bit of software. And you can see the color boxes I put here, which shows that some of them actually relate to completely different metaphors as well. So obviously remove isn't related to the game directly, it's related to the playlist, it's removing it from the playlist. And then set core association and reset core association, both of those are related to the core. And then finally information is where you can read more about a particular game. And then obviously on the right, we've kind of got similar mixed metaphors. Now, many of these are here because they're important, and they're important because when a user runs a game, they're likely to want to maybe change some of this stuff, right? I get it. But I think some of the areas particularly that could be improved are how we better organize this data or visualize this data or information, and sometimes downplay some stuff and upplay, if that makes sense, other stuff. So it's very important what the user should care about, and then the stuff that they shouldn't really care about is kind of like deprioritized visually. And then also going back to the previous screens, right? It doesn't feel that different. So the player's having, or the user, sorry, is having to do an awful lot of cognitive work to remember where they are, right? I've lost all concept of the playlist that I'm in now, right? I don't know what playlist I'm in anymore. I don't know where I am in relation to any of the user interface anymore, but it does look like another one of the lists from the previous, like the previous ones. And then when I run a game, I'm obviously in a game, and I can bring up the quick menu, and the quick menu doesn't look that different and has quite a smorgasbord of options. And again, probably many of these are actually valid for what the need of being able to access them quickly, but they are again a bunch of mixed metaphors as well, right? So resume, restart, close content, and saves are pretty much directly related to the specific game. Core options is there because some games you may want to tweak stuff versus another game, but is obviously related to the core. Controls, again, same reason. Maybe Street Fighter obviously requires a 6-button joystick, so potentially you might want to reconfigure your controls to account for that versus playing a side-scrolling shooter, let's say. And then some new, which haven't been introduced at all until this point, metaphors, which are largely social, have appeared at the bottom as well. So again, I think the great thing is that many of the features are like in the right places conceptually from like when I'm doing this, I will need access to these. But I think from a user interface and user experience design perspective, there's no hierarchy and no concept of how these relate to each other, how they reinforce the metaphors that we're trying to train the user, et cetera, there. And so it just becomes, well, as you can see on screen, just a big list of stuff. So I put together a very quick diagram of roughly how a lot of these things interlink. Now, it's not exhaustive. I'm sure there's loads of other stuff that it could be. But RetroArch, you can obviously create and edit playlists, and you can also edit and install core settings, right? And then from a playlist, you can run a game, but you can also change the core that's associated with and do a bunch of other core-related stuff. When you're go to a game, you can obviously, as we've just seen, change the core settings as well, and you can change the controller settings. RetroArch itself can change the controller settings. The core can also change its controller settings. And while all of those are possibly necessary and valid things, this is why it becomes quite difficult, I think, for the user to start to be able to visualize where they are, what they're doing, what's affecting anything else. And so the following diagram is to try and better suggest how we could start to organize some of this, right? We need to find ways, and this is a very simple diagram to do, but a hard diagram to actually bring into reality when we try and do it through user interface. But the goal, in my view, is that RetroArch itself should be something that should like metaphorically sit in the background, because ultimately it's running everything that's happening here, and many of the settings that that can be changed are controlling all of this. And so then we find ways to bring to the foreground much more the central concepts, which are playlists, cores, games, and controllers. And when you move from one to another to change settings, that we find a way to reinforce that that's what's happening. Because I feel like if you were physically being, and this is not an actual realistic statement, but I'm just using it maybe to help people visualize. If the user felt that they were physically being transported from game to core when they're editing core stuff, and then from core to controller when they're editing controller stuff, then that might help them feel less lost and start to make the user interface a lot more cohesive. Now, it's a really tricky challenge, right? I understand it, and probably a lot of people who are watching from the RetroArch side of things are like, how do we do this? Like, this is not possible. And it may not be possible, right? But I think the goal should be we should explore and investigate this. And worst case scenario, we come to the conclusion that, oh, well, we're just stuck with the UI we've got and people are just going to have to suck up, right? But I think from a best case scenario is that if I can tease out improvements and other ways of doing this that will be beneficial to the user, then we can see how far towards that we can go, right? And what compromises we have to make along the way. So that's the final slide for this part of the presentation for chapter 2. So if you've got any comments, please add them to the document. I'm obviously chatting with the team in Discord as well. So obviously you can comment there. And I will be carrying on this series. I want to start investigating user journeys to explain a little bit more about them. Not sure if that's going to be the next one or not yet. And I also want to start to do some little mock-ups to maybe start to illustrate some of my thoughts on how we could do this. So I'm not sure also if that's the next step or not. Anyway, keep an eye out for chapter 3 video. And thanks for watching. Hope you found that interesting. And as I said before, keep an eye out for the 3rd video and hit me up on the RetroArch Discord or via the comments in the slide deck if you've got any feedback, questions, etc. Thanks.